1883, Montana. The window that exposed a woman's dead double and drove a frontiersman to madness. Elias Harper rode slowly through the rough, uneven trail that led to the outskirts of the small Montana town. The spring wind was crisp and smelled of pine and damp earth, carrying a freshness that made him take a deep breath despite the soreness in his lungs from the long journey. His horse, a sturdy chestnut with a white blaze on its forehead, moved carefully over the rocky ground, sensing the uneven path beneath. Elias had been traveling for weeks, leaving behind the noise and chaos of the East, seeking something he couldn't name. He didn't want money or fame, and he certainly didn't want company. He wanted peace, a place where he could forget the sorrow that had followed him like a shadow. The wild frontier of Montana promised that, or so he hoped. The town came into view slowly, like a mirage made of dust and wooden buildings. There were only a few structures clustered together near a small stream that ran through the valley. A general store, a blacksmith shop, a saloon with a swinging door that creaked with every opening, and a few scattered homes that looked worn and tired from years of weather and neglect. Children ran along the dirt road, their laughter carried by the wind, but even that seemed cautious, as if the wide-open plains beyond their homes demanded respect. Elias felt both relief and unease at the sight. Relief, because he had finally found a place to stop. Unease, because the town was silent in a way that seemed unusual, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something. Elias tied his horse to a wooden post in front of the general store. The bell above the door jingled softly as he pushed it open, announcing his arrival. Inside, the smell of dried herbs, leather, and wood smoke greeted him. The storekeeper, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and a wary look in his eyes, lifted his gaze from behind the counter. "Morning," he said, his voice cautious. "You new around here?"
Yes, Elias replied, keeping his tone low and calm. Looking for a place to stay and maybe some supplies?
"Cabin's out by the cliff, north of the stream. Old place, but solid enough. Not many folks go up there. Quiet, if that's what you want." Elias felt a small flicker of hope. Quiet was exactly what he wanted. He purchased basic provisions, some dried meat, a loaf of hard bread, coffee, and a few candles, before heading back to his horse. As he rode toward the cabin the storekeeper had mentioned, the land began to open up. The dirt path narrowed, flanked by clusters of pine and wildflowers that swayed in the wind. The air was alive with the sounds of birdsong and the faint rustle of leaves, and Elias felt the weight of weeks of travel begin to lift from his shoulders. Finally the cabin appeared. It was older than he expected, built of darkened logs with a stone chimney that had seen better days. Its roof sagged slightly and the windows were small, covered in thick grime that dulled the sunlight. Yet, despite its flaws, the cabin had a quiet dignity. It looked like it had endured storms, snow, and years of neglect, yet it still stood, strong and defiant. Elias dismounted and ran his hand over the rough wood of the door. The cabin smelled faintly of smoke and earth, a combination that felt oddly comforting. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was dim, lit only by shafts of sunlight that crept through the dusty windows. A thick layer of dust covered the wooden floor, and cobwebs hung in the corners like delicate lace. The fireplace, though cold, looked sturdy enough to warm him during the harsh Montana winters. There was a small kitchen area with a chipped sink and a few cupboards, and a loft above that promised a place to sleep. Elias dropped his pack and began to explore, running his fingers along the walls and floors. Despite the dust and age, the cabin had a kind of calm presence, as if it had been waiting for someone like him. Outside, the wind carried whispers of the valley below. Elias walked to the edge of the cliff behind the cabin, peering down at the wide stretch of land that rolled toward the distant mountains. Streams glittered in the sunlight like ribbons of silver, and patches of forest dotted the plains like green islands. It was breathtaking. For a moment he felt free. No town to worry about, no people to answer to, just him and the wild. And yet, there was an odd sense of being watched. He shook it off, telling himself it was the wind or the way the trees moved shadows across the ground. That evening Elias built a small fire outside, letting the smoke rise into the pale sky. The sound of the crackling wood was the only thing that broke the silence. He ate a simple meal and then sat staring at the valley below, letting his mind wander. Memories of the past crept in, the city he had left behind, the faces of people he once knew, and the one face he could never forget. He shivered partly from the cool Montana air and partly from the feeling that his life had changed forever the moment he arrived in this lonely place. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, shadows stretched across the land like fingers reaching out to him. Elias went inside the cabin and lit a candle. The flickering light danced across the walls, throwing shadows that seemed to move like living creatures. He tried to focus on practical matters, checking the fireplace, stacking wood, and preparing a place to sleep in the loft. Yet his thoughts kept drifting. There was something about this place, something he couldn't explain, that felt almost alive. He tried to shake the feeling, attributing it to exhaustion and the isolation he had brought upon himself. Before going to bed, Elias walked around the outside of the cabin one last time. That's when he noticed it, an abandoned house not far from his own cabin, partially hidden among the trees. Its windows were cracked and dark, the roof sagging, and the door hanging loosely on its hinges. Something about the house drew his attention, though he couldn't say why. It looked empty, yet there was an energy about it, a sense that it had stories trapped within its walls. Elias stared at it for a long moment, feeling a mix of curiosity and unease. He decided not to approach it that night, convincing himself that it was late and that the cold wind had made him imagine things. Back in his cabin, Elias finally climbed to the loft. The mattress was thin, and the blankets smelled faintly of smoke and dust. He lay down, staring at the ceiling beams above, listening to the wind as it whistled through the cracks in the cabin walls. Sleep came slowly, teased by the sounds of the valley. Distant animal cries, the rustle of trees, and the occasional creak of his own cabin settling. As he drifted, he dreamt of faces in windows, shadows moving, and the feeling of being watched. It was only a dream, he told himself, yet it lingered in his mind like a whisper he could not shake. The next morning, Elias awoke to the soft light of dawn spilling into the cabin. He felt a strange excitement, the kind that comes with the unknown. Montana was vast and wild, and he was alone. The town was quiet, the people wary, and the land full of secrets. Yet, he felt ready. He packed his supplies, tended to his horse, and looked once more at the abandoned house across the way. Something told him he would be returning to it, drawn by curiosity he did not yet understand. As Elias set out for the day, exploring the cliffs and forests surrounding his new home, he felt the first stirrings of a story unfolding, a story of loneliness, discovery, and something unexplainable waiting in the shadows. The frontier was more than a place. It was a challenge to his mind, body, and spirit. He knew that whatever awaited him in Montana, he would face it alone, armed with nothing but his wits, courage, and a deep, restless need to find something he had lost long ago. Days passed in the Montana wilderness, and Elias Harper settled slowly into his new life. He learned to rise with the sun, to check his supplies, and to ride the trails for hunting and exploration. Each morning, the land stretched before him like a vast, untamed canvas, alive with sounds of nature he had long forgotten. Birds sang from the treetops, the river gurgled through the valley, and the wind whispered through the pine needles. Yet, despite the beauty, there was always a pull in the back of his mind. The abandoned house across the way. It sat quietly, hidden among the trees, its windows dark and cracked, as if it were waiting for something, or someone. Elias tried to dismiss it at first. He told himself that a man like him, who had come to Montana for peace, had no business worrying about an empty, crumbling house. He busied himself with chores, hunting deer for meat and gathering firewood to keep the cabin warm. He repaired small parts of his home, swept the floor, and stocked the shelves with supplies from town. But no matter how busy he kept himself, his thoughts kept drifting back to the house. There was a strange feeling about it, a presence that made his skin prickle and his heart race. He could not explain it. Something about the house drew him in, quietly, persistently, like a whisper in the wind. One late afternoon after returning from a long ride, Elias paused near his cabin, wiping sweat from his brow, when he noticed movement inside the abandoned house.
At first, he thought it was an animal, perhaps a stray dog or a bird that had found its way in.
But then he saw her. A woman stood in one of the windows, barely moving, her figure blurred by the cracked glass and dust. His heart stopped. For a moment, he could not breathe. She was tall and slender, wearing a dress that seemed old-fashioned, yet familiar in a way he could not place. Her hair fell in dark waves, catching the sunlight in a way that made it glow. Elias squinted, taking careful steps closer, his boots crunching on the dry dirt. His mind raced. Could it be a ghost? Could someone have moved in without the townspeople noticing? But there was something more terrifying than the thought of a stranger, the woman's face. It was familiar, impossibly familiar. The more he stared, the more he realized that she looked exactly like someone he had known long ago, a woman he had loved and lost, a woman who had died tragically years before he had left the East. Elias felt his knees weaken. Could it be? Could the world play such a cruel trick on him? He blinked, and the figure seemed to flicker, as if she were not quite solid. The wind rustled through the trees, and the branches cast moving shadows across the broken window. For a moment he convinced himself it was the sunlight and shadows playing tricks on his tired eyes. Yet when he looked again, she was still there, standing perfectly still, staring straight at him. Her gaze was intense, almost knowing, as though she understood him better than anyone else ever had. Elias swallowed hard, unsure whether to approach or flee. Curiosity won over fear. Slowly he moved closer to the edge of the clearing where the house stood. Every step was deliberate, cautious, and his heart thumped in his chest so loudly he feared it might give him away. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of its old timbers. The closer he got, the clearer he saw the woman. Her eyes were dark, reflective, and filled with a depth that Elias could not name. He had never seen anyone like her, and yet he had seen her every day in his memories. Her laugh, her smile, the tilt of her head, everything. It was impossible. She should have been dead. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, hidden behind a tree, and watched. She did not move. She did not blink. It was as though she existed in a world separate from his own. Elias felt a cold chill run down his spine. He wondered if he had finally lost his mind, if the isolation and harsh Montana winds had begun to play tricks on him. But then, small details confirmed that what he saw was real. The way the sunlight caught her hair, the slight movement of her hands, the way the fabric of her dress shifted in the breeze. She was real. Somehow, impossibly real. Over the next several days, Elias returned to watch her from a distance. He did not speak to her, fearing he might shatter some fragile balance he could not understand. Yet, he could not stop thinking about her. He sketched her in a small notebook he carried, drawing the faint outline of her face, the curve of her shoulders, the stance that reminded him so painfully of his lost love. He kept the notebook hidden in his cabin, afraid anyone in town might see it and think him mad. The sketches became almost an obsession, each line reinforcing what he already suspected. She was somehow the same woman, though she could not possibly be alive. At night, when the wind rattled the windows of his cabin, Elias found himself staring at the same empty house, trying to picture her there. He dreamed of her face, of the expression in her eyes, and sometimes he thought he could hear her whispering his name. It was maddening, a constant pull on his mind that left him restless and anxious. Yet he could not resist it. He felt as if some invisible thread connected him to her, a connection that defied reason and logic. He wondered if he had been drawn to Montana not for peace but for this encounter, a meeting with something he could neither fully understand nor escape. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and painted the sky in streaks of orange and purple, Elias decided he would try to get a closer look. He approached the house cautiously, moving silently across the dry grass and rocks. His heart pounded in his chest, and his hands trembled, not with fear, but with anticipation. The closer he got, the more he felt the odd sense of familiarity, as if he had been here before, in another life. The woman remained in the window, motionless, watching him. Her eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dying light, and Elias felt a shiver run through him. He paused, standing in the shadow of a tree, debating whether to call out or remain hidden. He did not know what he would say if she answered, or if she could even hear him. But then, in that quiet, suspended moment, a gust of wind blew through the clearing, rattling the broken windows and sending dust swirling into the air. The woman's image flickered, and for a moment, Elias thought she had vanished entirely. Panic surged through him. He feared he had imagined the whole thing, that his mind was breaking under the weight of solitude and longing. Yet, when he blinked, she was still there, her eyes fixed on him with a silent intensity that left him breathless. Elias stepped back into the shadows and retreated toward his cabin, unsure of what he had just witnessed. His mind raced with questions and doubts, but there was one undeniable truth. He could not stop thinking about her. He did not understand how it was possible, nor did he know whether it was dangerous or safe. All he knew was that something had changed. The Montana wilderness, once a place of peace and solitude, had become a place of mystery and obsession. Something in that abandoned house had reached out to him, and he felt powerless to resist its pull. That night he sat by his fireplace, the sketches of her spread across the table. He traced each line with his finger, studying the details he had committed to paper. Her face seemed to move under his gaze, as if alive, as if aware that he was watching. Sleep came only fitfully, interrupted by dreams of windows and shadows, whispers and footsteps. By dawn he was exhausted. Yet the thought of the woman awaited him in his mind as surely as the rising sun awaited the valley. Elias understood one thing with painful clarity. His life in Montana had changed. What began as a search for solitude had become a journey into the unknown, a confrontation with something he could not explain. The woman in the abandoned house, the reflection of a past long buried, had awakened something inside him: curiosity, fear, longing, and a restless need to know the truth. He did not know what the future held, but he knew that he could not turn away. Montana had offered him a new beginning, and yet it had also offered him a mystery that would not leave him, no matter how much he wished it could. Days turned into weeks, and Elias Harper's life began to revolve around the abandoned house. What had started as a fleeting curiosity had grown into a quiet obsession. Each morning, before the sun fully rose over the Montana mountains, he would rise from his loft and make his way to the edge of his property. From there, he could see the house across the clearing, standing silently among the trees. He would watch, heart beating, as though expecting her to appear at any moment. At first, he tried to rationalize what he saw. Perhaps someone had moved into the house, he thought. Perhaps it was a trick of the light, or a reflection from the windows. But every time he looked, the woman remained, standing perfectly still, staring straight at him. Elias found himself sketching her more and more. The small notebook he carried everywhere became filled with delicate lines capturing the curve of her jaw, the tilt of her head, and the mysterious expression in her eyes. Each drawing seemed more detailed than the last, almost as if his mind refused to forget any part of her face. He would trace over the sketches repeatedly, committing every line to memory, as if doing so would make him understand the impossible truth before him. The townspeople noticed his absences but said nothing. Elias kept to himself, moving through town only when necessary. Even at the store he was quiet, speaking little and avoiding eye contact. His thoughts were constantly occupied by the woman. He began to dream of her at night, vivid dreams where she moved and spoke, though he could never hear her words clearly. Sometimes she was smiling, sometimes silent, sometimes watching him with a gaze that seemed to pierce his very soul. He would wake with a start, heart racing, unsure whether he had been asleep or awake, whether the vision was real or imagined. He began to question his own mind. Was he losing control? Was he seeing things that weren't there? Yet no matter how much he tried to convince himself otherwise, he returned each day to watch her, drawn by a force he could not explain. One afternoon, Elias noticed something strange. The woman's reflection seemed different from the rest of the house. In the cracked glass of the window, the light caught her in a way that made her appear almost alive, as if she could step through the glass at any moment. Her presence was more vivid, more demanding than before, and Elias felt a pull he could not resist. He found himself walking closer to the clearing than ever before, crouching behind trees, observing every slight movement, every flicker of light. It was as though the house and the woman inside it were calling to him, guiding him towards something he could not yet see or understand. Elias began to notice other details as well. He could hear faint noises from the house. The creak of a floorboard, the soft rustle of clothing, the whisper of a footstep. It terrified him, yet it also thrilled him. Each sound was proof that the house was not empty, that the woman was real. He began to keep notes on these observations, jotting down times and patterns, as if studying the house scientifically could reveal the truth behind the impossible vision. The notebook grew thick with entries, each page filled with careful sketches, observations, and the occasional question scribbled in the margins. He often reread his own notes late at night, running a hand over the lines trying to find a clue hidden in the details. Sleep became more difficult. Elias would lie awake in the loft, staring at the ceiling beams, imagining her face reflected in the window across the clearing. The wind seemed louder at night, whispering through the cracks in the cabin walls, carrying sounds that might have been real or might have been imagined. Shadows shifted and moved, and sometimes he thought he could see her standing outside, just at the edge of his sight. He tried to remind himself that it was only his imagination, that isolation could make a man see things that were not there. Yet deep down, he knew it was something more. He began to take risks, moving closer to the house during the day, attempting to catch a better glimpse of her. Each time he felt a mix of fear and exhilaration, as if he were approaching something sacred and forbidden at the same time. The woman never moved, never blinked, yet her presence grew heavier, more undeniable. Elias started to notice the way light and shadow played across her figure, how her reflection seemed almost to respond to him, as if she were aware of his gaze. He could not explain it, and he did not try. He only watched, recording every detail in his notebook, trying to make sense of a mystery that made no sense. His friends in town began to notice a change in him. Those few who had attempted conversation found him distant, distracted, and restless. He stopped joining them at the saloon, stopped exchanging casual greetings, and even avoided the general store whenever possible. He spent hours in the wilderness, walking through the forest, climbing the cliffs, and watching the house from afar. He no longer hunted for food with the same purpose. Instead, he wandered, restless and unsettled, drawn by the unknown. When he returned to the cabin, he would sit by the fire, examining his sketches and notes by candlelight, reliving every moment he had observed the woman, every detail of her impossible presence. There were nights when Elias thought he could hear her whispering from the house. The sound was faint, almost too soft to be real, like the wind carrying a voice that was never truly there. Yet each time he heard it, his heart leapt, and he felt a surge of fear and desire all at once. He began to speak to her aloud, though no one was there to hear him. "Who are you?" he would ask, his voice barely more than a whisper. "How are you here?" Sometimes he received no answer. Sometimes the wind seemed to shift, and he swore he could feel her presence closer, as if she were listening. Elias's mind grew restless and sharp. He found himself unable to concentrate on practical matters. Meals went cold, the fire burned low, and chores were left undone. His obsession was consuming him, filling every moment with thoughts of her reflection, and the abandoned house. He would sit for hours, staring at the clearing, lost in a trance. His sketches grew more detailed, almost lifelike, capturing the essence of a woman who should not exist. The more he drew, the more real she seemed, until he could hardly distinguish between the vision and reality. The townspeople began to whisper, noting the change in Elias. He no longer walked the streets or exchanged greetings. He was often seen staring off into the distance, muttering to himself, sketchbook in hand. Some said he had gone mad, that the isolation and obsession with the wilderness had taken its toll. Others believed he had discovered something strange, a mystery that no one else could see. Yet no one dared approach him, for there was something unsettling in his presence, a mixture of intensity and fear that warned them to stay away. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low behind the mountains, Elias made a decision. He would get closer, risk entering the clearing and observe the house as never before. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from anticipation. He moved quietly through the grass and trees, feeling the pull of the house like a magnet. When he finally reached the edge of the clearing, he crouched behind a bush and peered at the window. She was there, her eyes fixed on him, motionless, yet impossibly alive. His heart pounded in his chest, and he felt a strange mixture of awe and terror. He realized in that moment that he could not turn away. Elias understood, fully and painfully, that the woman in the abandoned house had become the center of his life. She consumed his thoughts, his dreams, and even his waking moments. He could not leave the house behind. He could not ignore the pull she exerted on him. The Montana wilderness, once a place of peace, had become a stage for something beyond understanding, and Elias, drawn by obsession and wonder, knew that he was stepping closer to a truth that might shatter his mind or change his life forever. The days had grown longer, but for Elias Harper, time seemed to stretch and twist in ways he could no longer measure. His life had become a rhythm of obsession. Wake, watch the abandoned house, sketch, dream, repeat. The forest and cliffs of Montana no longer felt like a place of peace. They were a stage for a mystery that consumed him. Every time he looked toward the clearing, the house called to him. It was no longer enough to observe from a distance. He needed to know. He needed to see, to touch, to understand what had haunted him for weeks. The pull of the unknown was irresistible. Early one morning, when the sun was just beginning to scatter golden light across the valley, Elias decided he would enter the house. His heart pounded as he approached, each step careful and deliberate. The ground was uneven, littered with stones and broken branches. He paused at the edge of the clearing, looking up at the old structure. The windows were grimy and cracked, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. It seemed to lean ever so slightly to one side, as if it had been waiting for him, expecting him to come. His hands shook slightly, though not from cold. It was anticipation, a nervous excitement, and a creeping fear he could not shake. He pushed the door slowly, and it creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty house. Dust rose into the air, and the smell of old wood, mold, and forgotten years filled his nostrils. The floorboards groaned under his weight. The interior was dim, lit only by shafts of sunlight that slipped through the broken windows. Shadows stretched across the walls, moving with the sway of the tree branches outside. The house was quiet, almost painfully so, except for the occasional scurrying of some small animal in the walls or under the floor. Elias swallowed hard. There was no one inside, yet somehow the feeling of her presence was stronger than ever. He moved from room to room cautiously, exploring the small, decaying space. Each corner seemed to hide secrets, the remnants of lives long forgotten. There was a broken table, a chair missing a leg, and a cracked mirror leaning against the far wall. Elias's eyes caught the mirror immediately, reflecting his own face in the dim light. But then, as he adjusted his gaze, he noticed another reflection in the window across the room. His breath caught in his throat. There she was, the woman. Her figure was pale and still, standing in the window of the abandoned house opposite him, though she should not have been visible from this angle. Elias stepped closer, his mind racing. He could not explain what he was seeing. The reflection seemed to move independently of her, shimmering faintly in the sunlight. It was as if two versions of her existed, one in the physical world and one in the window, watching him silently. He reached out a trembling hand toward the cracked glass, but it was impossible to touch her. The reflection wavered and flickered, almost like smoke, yet the details of her face remained sharp and haunting. Every feature was identical to the woman he had lost long ago. Every expression, every glance, was familiar in a way that made his heart ache. In that moment he noticed something else, a small, leather-bound journal lying on the floor beneath the window. He picked it up carefully, brushing off dust and dirt. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with handwriting in neat, precise letters. Elias's eyes widened as he began to read. The journal belonged to a woman who had lived in this house long ago, a woman whose life mirrored the life of the one he had loved. The entries described ordinary events: preparing meals, tending to chores, wandering the valley. But as he read further, the entries grew darker, more unsettling. She wrote of visions in the windows, of shadows that moved when no one was there, of feeling watched by something beyond understanding. Elias felt a chill run down his spine. The parallels were too perfect. The woman in the journal had died decades before. Yet here she appeared, reflected in the window, alive in a way that defied reason. He flipped through more pages, finding sketches and notes that mirrored his own observations of the abandoned house. It was as if she had recorded her own obsession, her own fascination with a presence she could not explain. Elias's hand trembled as he held the journal close. His mind spun with questions, doubts, and a deep, aching need to know the truth. How could this be possible? How could someone who had died long ago still exist, still watch, still reflect across time and space? The room felt colder, heavier, as if the house itself were aware of his presence. The shadows shifted more sharply, stretching across the walls in impossible angles. Elias turned slowly toward the mirror, and in its cracked surface he thought he saw two faces looking back at him. One was his own, tired and drawn from weeks of obsession. The other was hers, pale, still, and impossibly alive. He could not breathe. The reflection stared at him silently, unblinking, and he felt a deep, unsettling connection, as if it were peering not just at him, but into him, reading the memories, fears, and longings he had kept hidden for years. He staggered backward, clutching the journal to his chest. The wind outside rattled the broken windows, and for a moment he could have sworn he heard her voice, faint and soft, calling his name. It was almost impossible to distinguish from the sound of the trees and the rustling leaves, yet it carried a weight, a meaning, that made him shiver. The world outside the abandoned house seemed to fade away, leaving only him, the reflection, and the journal in his trembling hands. He realized with a sudden clarity that he could not leave this place. He could not turn away. He had crossed a line, stepped into a story that was larger than himself, and now he was a part of it, whether he wanted to be or not. Hours passed. Though he did not notice the movement of the sun, he remained in the room, studying the reflections, the journal, and the shifting shadows. The more he looked, the more he felt he was unraveling, losing the clear distinction between reality and vision. The house seemed alive, responding to him in subtle ways. The creak of the floorboards echoed his steps, the shifting dust seemed to form shapes in the corners, and the wind whispered in patterns he could almost understand. He realized, with a mix of fear and awe, that he had entered a world where ordinary rules no longer applied, where past and present life and death merged in ways he could not fully comprehend. By the time Elias finally stepped out of the abandoned house, the sky was a deep, fading gold, casting long shadows across the clearing. He paused, looking back at the structure, and saw her again in the window, perfectly still, watching him. A shiver ran through him. She had not moved, had not blinked, yet her presence seemed to burn into his memory, impossible to forget or ignore. Clutching the journal tightly, he stumbled back toward his cabin, his mind spinning with questions he could not answer. Every step felt heavy, as if the ground itself were pulling him into a story that would never release him. That night, he sat by the fireplace in his cabin, the journal open before him. He traced the lines of the handwriting, rereading the passages that mirrored his own experiences, and stared at the sketches that looked almost identical to his own drawings. The reflection in the window haunted him even in the flickering candlelight. He wondered how it was possible, how the past could reach across time, how a woman who had died decades before could appear before him in a way that was real and undeniable. Sleep came only fitfully, filled with shadows, whispers, and the sense of being watched. Elias understood something profoundly unsettling. The abandoned house and the woman it contained were not simply relics of the past. They were living, breathing parts of the world around him, bending reality in ways he could not fully explain. He could not leave it behind. He could not ignore it. Something about this house, the reflection, and the journal had reached into his mind, into his very soul, and awakened a fascination, a terror, and a longing that would not be denied. Montana had given him solitude, yes, but it had also given him a mystery that demanded his attention, his energy, and perhaps even his sanity. Elias knew as he closed the journal and stared into the darkness outside his cabin window that he was no longer simply a man observing from afar. He had become a part of the story, a character in a tale that defied explanation, and the line between the living and the dead, the real and the reflected, had begun to blur in ways he could not control. The pull of the abandoned house, the strange reflection, and the woman's impossible presence would follow him, shape him, and haunt him from that moment forward. Days and nights blurred together for Elias Harper. Time had lost all meaning in the Montana wilderness, replaced instead by a relentless cycle of observation, sketches, and obsessive thought. The abandoned house across the clearing had become the center of his world. Each morning he rose with the sun and immediately made his way to the edge of his property, his eyes scanning the house for any sign of the woman he could not forget. Each evening he returned to his cabin, clutching the journal and reviewing his sketches, tracing lines and faces until his hands grew sore. Sleep had become a fleeting luxury, and when it came, it brought only dreams of shadows, windows, and whispers calling his name. Elias no longer attempted to interact with the townspeople. The few who saw him noted his pale face, hollow eyes, and quiet mutterings to himself. Some whispered he had gone mad, that the isolation and obsession with the wilderness had taken a toll. Others believed he had discovered something supernatural, a mystery that no one else could see. Elias did not care. He had retreated entirely into his own world, where the boundaries between reality and vision were thin and shifting. Every thought, every heartbeat was tethered to the abandoned house and the woman's reflection. One evening, a sudden storm swept through the valley. The wind howled, rattling the wooden shutters of his cabin and bending the trees as if they were alive. Elias watched from the loft as sheets of rain struck the ground, turning the earth to mud and the river to a rushing torrent. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the clearing and the abandoned house across the way. And there she was. Even in the storm, even through the sheets of rain and flashes of lightning, her figure remained in the window, motionless, unblinking, yet impossibly alive. Her presence was so vivid that Elias felt as if she were standing right beside him. Driven by an urgency he could no longer resist, Elias threw on his coat and ran through the storm toward the house. The rain soaked him instantly, his boots slipping on the wet ground, but he did not care. He had to see her, had to confront the mystery that had consumed his every thought for weeks. The wind tore at his coat and whipped his hair across his face. But when he arrived at the clearing, the woman's reflection was there, clear and impossible, in the window that had haunted him for so long. His heart raced, and a mixture of fear, wonder, and longing surged through him. He stepped inside the abandoned house, ignoring the creaking floorboards beneath him. The storm's roar outside was a dull echo compared to the pounding of his own heart. He clutched the leather-bound journal to his chest, tracing its worn edges as if it could guide him. The house was dark, the faint shafts of lightning from the storm illuminating the cracked windows and shadows. And then he saw it. In the large broken mirror that leaned against the far wall, there were two reflections staring back at him. One was his own, exhausted and hollow-eyed. The other was hers, pale, still, and impossibly real. Elias reached out with trembling hands, desperate to touch her, to confirm that she was real, yet the reflection rippled like water at his touch, refusing to solidify. The wind outside rattled the broken windows, and he could almost hear her voice, soft and urgent, whispering words he could not understand. His knees buckled, and he sank to the floor, holding the journal tightly. The lines between reality and vision had collapsed entirely. He could no longer tell if she was there in the world, if she existed only in the reflections, or if she was something beyond life itself. Night after night, Elias returned to the house. He could not eat properly, could not sleep more than a few hours at a time, and could not focus on anything other than the woman. He spoke to her aloud, asking questions, pleading for answers, and listening for responses in the wind, the shifting shadows, and the faint creak of floorboards. Sometimes he thought he heard her laughter, faint and musical, echoing through the empty rooms. Other times she was silent, her gaze steady and unyielding, as if challenging him to understand something beyond reason. Elias's sketches became more frantic, more detailed, capturing not only her face but the atmosphere of the house itself, the angles of the broken windows, the light reflected in the cracked glass, the shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The journal he had discovered became his constant companion, filled with her observations and thoughts from decades ago. He reread it obsessively, comparing her words with his own experiences, as if doing so could reveal the secret that had drawn them together across time. Yet the more he read, the more questions arose. How could she exist here now, when her life had ended long before? How could a reflection be so real, so tangible in its effect on him? The townspeople eventually noticed that Elias had disappeared entirely from their lives. He no longer went to the store, no longer rode into town, no longer exchanged even a word with anyone. His cabin grew dark and unkempt, the fire often left to burn low, and his meals forgotten. He wandered the wilderness during the day, drawn inevitably to the clearing, where the abandoned house waited like a silent sentinel. His life had become a single thread woven entirely around the presence of a woman he could not explain, a reflection that defied reason, and a house that seemed alive with memory and mystery. Then came the night when Elias finally understood, or thought he did. As he sat in the abandoned house, the storm raging outside, he traced his finger along the cracked mirror and the window, following the contours of her face in the reflection. For a brief moment he felt a connection that went beyond sight, a pull between himself and something ancient, something that existed outside time and space. He felt grief and longing and love, all compressed into a single overwhelming sensation. The reflection seemed to tremble slightly, almost acknowledging him, and he wept silently, exhausted by weeks of sleepless nights and obsessive thought. After that night, Elias never left the clearing for long. He moved into the abandoned house entirely, bringing with him only his journal, his sketches, and the few supplies he could carry. He no longer attempted to rationalize what he saw. He no longer questioned whether the woman was alive or dead, real or reflected. He had crossed the boundary into a world where reason no longer mattered, and he accepted it. His mind, once sharp and focused, had become entwined with the mystery of the house, the reflection, and the journal. The frontier of Montana had given him solitude, but it had also given him obsession, a story that demanded his participation and would not release him. Years passed, though it is impossible to say exactly how many. Travelers through the valley occasionally reported seeing a lone figure moving in the clearing, sketches and papers clutched to his chest, eyes fixed on the abandoned house. Some claimed to hear whispers on the wind, though no one could say what they were. The house itself remained as it had been. Cracked windows, sagging roof, shadows shifting in strange patterns. And in the window, for those who were brave enough to look, there seemed to be a faint reflection of a woman, pale, still, watching, unblinking, eternal. Elias Harper's story became legend in the Montana Valley, a cautionary tale told by locals to children and travelers alike. Some said he had gone mad, lost to obsession and the impossible reflection of a woman who should not exist. Others whispered that he had discovered a secret too vast for human understanding, a connection between life and death, time and memory, that few could comprehend. Yet all agreed on one thing. The man and the house were inseparable, bound together by a mystery that refused to release him. Even today, the valley remembers Elias Harper. The abandoned house still stands, silent but alive with history. The wind carries faint whispers through the trees, and those who dare to look into the windows sometimes swear they see movement, a reflection that should not be. Elias's life, consumed by obsession and mystery, serves as a reminder of the fragile line between curiosity and madness, between reality and the visions that lurk just beyond understanding. The frontier of Montana, with its vast wilderness and quiet secrets, had given him solitude, and had taken everything else, leaving only the man, the house, and the reflection to endure for all time.